It's Nerdy, and welcome back to the Transmissions Draft League, season number 4. Today we have got our matchup for week number 3, a cross-divisional matchup versus the Infernal Infernapes. Now, both of our teams are 1-1 so far, with 1 sweep and 1 3-game set. I will say, I think that it's reasonable to say that we are a little bit more confident going into this week, given that our set was at least close because of a little bit of misplay and a little bit of bad luck. You could say the same for our opponent, but I think that was more of a product of them going away from their strategy, and ours was a product of us sticking with a strategy and just not playing it perfectly. But instead, we have our matchup with them this week. So let's go ahead and meet the team. Of course, as always, we have Iron Crown. However, we are bringing a maximum offense Iron Crown this week, outspeeding everything aside from the Thunderous and the Ambipom. Expanding Force, Tachyon Cutter, Terra Blast, and Volt Switch are all pretty solid moves this week, as well as Terra Poison is pretty oppressive in the matchup. Nothing can actually hit Poison for super effective unless they bring coverage. And it does resist a ton of our opponent's best damage from both Primarina, Rillaboom, Annihilate, and Iron Crown already matches up pretty solid against the Thunderous. Of course, we want to be hitting that thing with an Expanding Force, as Tachyon Cutter doesn't actually hit it that hard. But we are choice specs, as I said, so Iron Crown is here to go fast and hit hard, break things, and think about it later. Ogerpon is in a similar vein. Of course, this week we have elected to actually drop the Follow Me here for Grassy Glide. Our opponent does have Rillaboom, so if our opponent does choose to use Rillaboom really heavily, Ogerpon actually super benefits from that and can chunk things that don't resist the Grassy Glide for upwards of 40 to 50%. And as always, Ivy Cudgel and Hornleech are incredibly strong, and Hornleech even more so when we are in a scenario where we get benefits like the grassy terrain. That being said, it is kind of another scenario of go fast and break things, which is kind of the theme for this team, as you will see. Next up, we do have in DDF with the Rocky Helmet and Follow Me. Our opponent does have a couple of strong physical attackers, but we do also want to be able to support our team. Terra Poison, as I said, is excellent defensive typing. It's actually great offensively as well, as it does hit the Rillaboom and the Primarina for super effective damage, as well as the Clefairy. But this week we are bringing Follow Me, Helping Hand, and Skill Swap as our third support move of choice. This is basically just to be able to say that Rillaboom is never a completely safe switch. It does allow them to get around things like the Psychic Surge blocking Prankster, but it does mean that in certain scenarios we can still set up Psychic Terrain for the Iron Crown in the back or up front or whatever it may be. And Psychic actually is pretty great this matchup. If it hits super effectively in the Psychic Terrain, it's dealing upwards of 70% to something like Annihilate, and that's a bulky Annihilate. If the Annihilate doesn't actually carry that much bulk, Psychic can deal upwards of 90. So despite no offensive investment, really great stuff out of Indeedee. The other thing is that Rocky Helmet is kind of just nice to have in a matchup where our opponent probably has to lean into their physical attackers more than their special attackers. Their special attackers are actually pretty decent, but not into our best Pokemon. Thunderous, offensively at least, doesn't threaten anything on our team, basically at all, and we threaten a lot more damage to it than it can deal to us. As for defensively, it also doesn't stomach attacks all that well unless it resists them, in which case it's pretty solid against the stabs of Iron Crown and Hariyama, but both of those Pokemon have coverage moves that can actually hurt it pretty bad. Speaking of Hariyama, we have a Guts Flame Orb set this week, also Terra Poison. Now, Ironically, I actually think that Hariyama is our best offensive Pokemon in this match. However, it does require the most speed control. We are running enough speed so that we can outspeed a Pokemon that also gets a speed boost, such as Primarina. But we are kind of just, as with our other two offensive Pokemon, just trying to go fast and hit hard. Poison Jam, Close Combat, and Headlong Rush hit a ton of things really hard. Of course, the only thing we don't hit as hard is the Thunderous, but even a Terra Poison Jam does hurt that thing pretty hard if we are burned. So looking forward to being able to make use of that. No fake out on this Hariyama set. It is a little bit awkward to have that, of course. I think the reasoning behind it is just that we wanted to be able to threaten damage right away. And even without a Guts boost, Hariyama still does a ton of damage. So being able to keep ourselves safe, but also being able to hit really hard is really nice. The other thing to call out is that Headlong Rush is mostly just a coverage move for if our opponent decides to spend a certain Terra. This could be like Terra Steel or Terra Fire or even a Terra Poison of their own. The best case scenario for them would, in my opinion, probably be Terra Poison after Iron Crown is dealt with. And obviously that doesn't work against Headlong Rush. Terra Fire does really bad into Ogerpon because of Ivy Cudgel. And Terra Steel already doesn't work into Hariyama because of Close Combat. So there's no good answer for our opponent Terra-wise. Our next support Pokemon is, of course, as always, Talonflame. Still offensive, which is, in my opinion, the best part about using Talonflame. Terra Ghost plus Sharp Beak does mean that we can get around things like Fake Out. We are packing Protect so that we're not forced to pop the Terra Ghost immediately. But a Sharp Beak with Brave Bird does mean that we get to almost guaranteed KO every version of Rillaboom and most versions of Annihilate. And Will-O-Wisp means that we don't even have to threaten them offensively. We can force them into forcing a Terra with something like that Brave Bird, and then actually just burn those Pokemon, making them basically obsolete for the entire game. Finally, we have a Choice Scarf Squawkabilly with Intimidate and Final Gambit. The idea with Squawkabilly is that our opponent only has two Pokemon that have more HP than Squawkabilly. Those are Rillaboom and Annihilate, which of course, as you saw, we have a ton of hate for both of those Pokemon. Which does mean that if Final Gambit can land, it can change a lot of matchups. So if there's any problem Pokemon that our team is not fully equipped to handle, Squawkabilly can deal with it. And yeah, that is what we are bringing for this week. I am excited to be going extremely fast and hitting extremely hard. Hopefully between our three offensive Pokemon we can get it done. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the game. Alright, we've made it to the match. Looks like our opponent brought every Pokemon we prepped for, the exact 6. So let's go ahead and check out what sets they brought. Assault Vest Rillaboom is to be expected. Of course, they are also bringing Snarl and Grassy Pledge. It is a Magnet Thundurus with Terra Dark, trying to presumably escape some of those Psychic type damage that we could throw at it. In my opinion, that does make it more Steel weak. But Wild Bolt Storm, Rain Dance, and Eerie Impulse. It does look like they are looking to get a little bit more value out of those Wild Bolt Storms. Of course, Rain Dance does also mean that they could be leaning into Primarina, which it does look like they are. No speed control here is actually pretty good for us, as it does mean that we should be outspeeding our opponent's team even without the help of Talonflame. And we do see it is a Terra Steel with Hyper Voice, Water Pledge, and Dazzling Gleam. Couple of spread moves as well as Water Pledge there. And then finally we also have Ambipom with a Wide Lens, Technician here with Fake Out, Triple Axle, Aerial Ace, and Beat Up, presumably for the Annihilate, which is actually a Final Gambit Choice Scarf set. So that is a Pokemon that could actually outspeed us in this scenario. It is also Terra Dark, which is interesting to note. And then finally, of course, we do have that Friendguard Clefairy. So our opponent has a couple of leads that it looks like they are trying to kind of throw at us. Of course, Rillaboom Primarina is a pretty obvious one, given that both Pokemon have the Pledge moves. I could also see an Ambipom plus Annihilate lead. They do have Rage Fist, which does mean that they are considering that at least. I also am taking note of something like a Clefairy Primarina lead. That lead in particular is pretty weak to our Terra Poison strategies. So something to take note of there. I think personally, I am still leaning into the fact that we can just go fast and break things and think about the consequences later. And to me, what that looks like is Iron Crown, Ogerpon, Hariyama, and either Talonflame or Indeedee. I think at this point, it does seem that they are pretty invested in stopping our special offense with things like Eerie Impulse from the Thundurus. Now, that's not the end of the world for our Iron Crown, because we do have a choice item and a switch move, which does mean that we can actually get out of that situation pretty effectively. I think in lead, I do want to have two Pokemon that can use Protect. It just makes a lot of sense being able to block a Fake Out from our opponent. Initially, what I'm thinking is I would actually like to lead either Ogerpon or Hariyama next to Talonflame, as Talonflame still kind of threatens a lot of the things that our opponent wants to do with both Annihilate and the Rillaboom. Talonflame also just does provide a lot of speed control for our Hariyama. Ogerpon, on the other hand, does not threaten as much immediate damage aside from against the Thundurus and the Primarina. However, it's still pretty effective overall against our opponent's team. The other thing that I really like about Talonflame is by using Tailwind, it also invalidates our opponent trying to use that specific mode. I think what I'm going to favor in this position, at least, is going to be the Ogerpon Talonflame lead. It is a little bit weaker to the Primarina if it does use the Terra, but of course we do have Hariyama in the back, and I'm not planning on using my Terra on either Ogerpon or Talonflame. So being able to get a ton of damage out of those two is obviously really nice. Hariyama in the back with the Terra Poison, as well as the coverage to deal with everything on our opponent's team, is really nice. We do obviously need Talonflame to deal with the Annihilate early, so that it does not become a problem, or we need to have a superior speed control so that that does not become a problem. I'm also looking at, of course, Iron Crown here, because despite the Thundurus being pretty equipped to handle it, I don't think that it actually will do that well at that job. So let's just go ahead and lock in our 4. Let's see what our opponent leads. It's Clefairy and Thundurus, actually, which in my opinion is a pretty decent lead for us. Yeah, I think really easily here we can lock in an Ivy Cudgel into the Thundurus set here. The Clefairy doesn't have any damage moves actually, so it can't break Sturdy, nor can it break the Gale Wings on Talonflame. Ogerpon does not outspeed Thundurus. However, of course, we have Tailwind here. So I think worst case scenario would be something like Follow Me plus Wild Bolt Storm that connects on both, breaking both Sturdy and the Gale Wings. But if we have Tailwind up, then Talonflame is already fast enough for what we need it to do anyways. Could also just Protect with both here to scout a Protect from the Thundurus. I'm happy with any of those options, I think it's best to start stepping on the gas from the get. So let's go ahead and go for Ivy Cudgel plus a Tailwind here. It is Follow Me that comes out here. Tailwind going to allow us to move after that Rain Dance, and we deal about 50% to that Clefairy. Relatively good start for us there. It's still going to require our opponent to actually go for the correct attacks. Obviously, a Wild Bolt Storm should be coming out here from our opponent. So I will go ahead and click the Ivy Cudgel once again. I think this is worth going for a Protect with our Talonflame, just to scout out what our opponent wants to bring in. If there is a switch on this turn, it probably should be the Primarina or the Rillaboom in my opinion. So let's just go ahead and Protect with our Talonflame. It is Follow Me that comes out once again, and Ivy Cudgel does get a crit to take out the Clefairy. Wild Bolt Storm will get rid of our Sturdy, however. It is in fact the Primarina to switch in here. Both of these Pokemon can Protect. I am not as afraid, of course, of the Primarina. It is Life Orb and in Rain, so it is still very threatening, but it's pretty likely to use the Terra Steel here. So in my opinion, we're probably just going to switch out our Talonflame in order to get a second Tailwind off here. And I think we should just go for gold on the Thundurus, so let's go ahead and do that. Here we can pretty safely switch in the Iron Crown, still have one turn of Tailwind left, and be able to do whatever we want on the following turns. Let's go ahead and do that. It is the Terra Steel. Protect does come out from the Thundurus, which blocks our Ivy Cudgel, and Hyper Voice connects, not taking out either Pokemon actually. Alright. Now, I think Thundurus is probably going to stay in here and try to get damage down onto this Iron Crown. I think I'm okay with that. I think Iron Crown is not our win condition at this point. I think Hariyama is now, especially since we forced the Primarina into using Terra. We've gotten through one Pokemon already, and we should have speed control from here on out, allowing Hariyama to do its best work. So let's go ahead and just get a little bit of damage down with our Iron Crown here. I think that Tachyon Cutter should be our strongest move here. Let's go ahead and go for that. It is a grassy terrain switch for our opponent. Tachyon Cutter comes out, connects, and does a little bit of damage to the Primarina, who goes for a Hyper Voice to get a double knockout there. Okay, now we will switch in our Hariyama and Talonflame. Let's go ahead and go for a double Protect to block Fake Outs here, and of course continue to have our max HP as well as activate Guts. It is actually a switch to Thundurus here, as Hyper Voice comes out and is blocked by the Protects. And now Hariyama is burned. Alright. Like I said, still in a pretty decent spot. Let's go ahead and go for the Terra Poison here. I think it's not 100% guaranteed that our opponent does go for an attacking move with the Primarina. I think it's actually very exposed here. In my opinion, it's probably a switch or a Protect here. So I'm going to read that. The downside is not that big. So let's go ahead and get some free damage onto the Primarina, or the Thundurus, sorry, with the Terra Poison Poison Jab. And let's go ahead and click Tailwind. Tailwind does come out, Rain Dance does meet it, and Poison Jab will take out that Pokemon, as Hyper Voice actually one-hit KOs our Talonflame. aka Rillaboom, is going to be the switch here. Of course, we are going to protect to block a Fake Out and a Hyper Voice. Now we do have a turn of being faster than both of these Pokemon. Our opponent does have Wood Hammer, so pretty unlikely that we do survive here, but we should be able to take out one more Pokemon before we go down. And unfortunately, we do drop to that Wood Hammer, so we are down a game going into game number 2. Alright, heading into game number 2. Of course, I think we did leave the Primarina alone for just a little bit too long. I think instead what I'd rather do is I think I'd rather actually lead Hariyama here. I know in the last section I did make it the star of the show, but I think it can still be the star of the show even as the front-facing Pokemon, and I think that we should still be bringing all of our offensive pieces in this scenario. I think that our opponent is pretty likely to play the same way, although based on the way that they played their previous 2 weeks, I think they might be second guessing themselves and decide a different lead. Ideally, we see a similar lead from them. It is actually instead going to be the Primarina and the Rillaboom lead here. Honestly, this is excellent news for us, as both of these Pokemon absolutely have to Terra in front of our Hariyama. And I can pretty safely force them to make a choice here. I'm actually going to protect with both Pokemon here. It could be a Fake Out from the Rillaboom. And actually, it is going to be a Thundurus switch and a Clefairy switch. Honestly, pretty good news for us. I'm going to go ahead and go for a Terra Poison Jab into the Thundurus once again. And with the Talonflame, let's see. I mean, the downside here is we could do 0 damage to the Clefairy. I think I'm okay with that. Yeah, let's go ahead and go for the Terra Poison Jab, and we'll click Tailwind as well. It is Follow Me here, with no Terra from the Clefairy, so it will actually eat a Poison Jab. Wallbolt Storm connects on both and does actually manage to take out the Talonflame. So now we have 4 turns of Tailwind to get the best use out of. Let's go ahead and bring in our Ogerpon here. This does threaten both Pokemon pretty effectively with either Ivy Cudgel or the Grassy Glide. Of course here, I'm going to go ahead and go for the Poison Jab into the Clefairy slot. If it uses the Terra Steel here, that is good news for us. Also, anything that switches into that slot is threatened by that Poison Jab. And then we'll go Ivy Cudgel into the Thundurus slot. This is a pretty awkward spot for him to be in, as I think, given that we have speed control and a ton of offense on the board, there's not really too many defensive plays that he can effectively make here. Of course, the other good news about this is we do still have our Iron Crown in the back, which, given that our opponent doesn't have any speed control, and knowing all 4 Pokemon that our opponent has, we can pretty safely outspeed our opponent's team and still threaten a ton of damage. I think our opponent does have to try to favor taking out our Hariyama before it can become too much of an issue for our opponent. I believe that Wallbolt Storm actually got a pretty high roll on Hariyama there. So There is a chance that it can two-hit KO Hariyama, but I think that it is unlikely. The only other thing for us to consider here is potentially protecting our Hariyama because it is in such a good position. I think I'd rather do that. I know it puts on a ton of offensive pressure here, but I think I still would rather keep it around for a little bit longer. So instead, Ivy Cudgel will go ahead and take out the Clefairy as Ogerpon eats a Wild Bolt Storm there. And unfortunately, it does get paralyzed. That is pretty huge for us there. I could see our opponent going for Fake Out into the Hariyama slot here for free. So I am actually going to switch the Iron Crown in, and we are going to go for the Ivy Cudgel there. Fake Out does go into the Iron Crown slot. Wild Bolt Storm actually going to miss the Iron Crown. No full para here as Ivy Cudgel does take out the Thunderous. Right, and Primarina is now the switch. And we are still, in my opinion, in a decent position. Like I said, both of these Pokemon very threatened by Hariyama, which unfortunately won't be faster than them after this turn. So I think the important Pokemon to take out first is, of course, the Primarina. So we are going to go for the Tachyon Cutter plus the Horn Leech here. It is Terra Steel from the Primarina, so it will resist this Tachyon Cutter, and it will resist this Horn Leech, but we do get a little bit of healing back. Grassy Pledge is going to come out, connects on the Iron Crown, and will slow us down here, so that our opponent can now move first. I think we are still in a similar position that we were before. Let's go ahead and go for the Tachyon Cutter and the Horn Leech into the Primarina. I rethinking this a little bit. I think that we probably should be favoring an Ivy Cudgel here. It's just slightly stronger and does have a chance to crit. I think that our opponent is probably going to be double targeting into the Ogerpon slot so that it doesn't survive the double up. So we will actually require some crits here in order to get this win. There is also the option to protect the Ogerpon, which I think is what they're thinking about reading here. Hopefully they overthink it and double target the Iron Crown here, as I do think it would actually live any single attack from one of these Pokemon. It is actually Protect that comes out from the Primarina, which will drop our special attack as we double attack into the Protect. Thankfully, this does actually waste Swamp turns for our opponent, so I think I'm going to... I think I am going to now play into this a little bit more, and let's go ahead and try to Protect. Of course, we cannot. Would have been an excellent spot to actually get the Protect there. Unfortunately, we are starting to see a little bit of the luck come out. And we shall bring in our Hariyama. Let's go ahead and go for that protect. Try to salvage this. Obviously, Skipley very happy about the paralyze. It is pretty impactful in this position. I do think, though, that it is possible that this is not the end of the game, especially after that turn. Now our opponent actually is in a spot to lose the game, as Tachyon Cutter should take care of the Primarina. I don't believe that the Rillaboom can actually handle the Hariyama, so we might actually be able to win this game. Tachyon Cutter does actually take out the Primarina, and Hariyama will actually be able to take out the Rillaboom. So we are headed to a game number 3. Alright, one more game left, and it is certainly an interesting one to be in, actually. I think we correctly identified that Hariyama was still pretty important in the set. I think we incorrectly, however, identified that Talonflame was also important. I think our speed control is actually really super necessary, and we do actually need to be able to break through that Primarina pretty quickly. Now there is a pretty easy answer here, in my opinion. And now the question comes down to, is it worth leaving behind Iron Crown for Squawkabilly? And in my opinion, I think the answer is yes. The reason why the answer is yes is because it allows us to kind of ignore the Primarina and get a surprise attack off on it. Let's go ahead and use Hariyama Talonflame and Ogerpon and Squawkabilly. Let's see our opponent's leads. It is Clefairy and the Thundurus up against the Hariyama and the Talonflame. I mean, let's do what we do best, and let's go for the Terra Poison Jab. I believe we actually got a low roll in the last game, so let's actually just go ahead and go for the Protect here. It is Protect actually from the Clefairy as Rain Dance comes out, Poison Jab connects and does a little bit of damage there. Of course, no Guts just yet, which is why that does not do as much damage as we were expecting. But we can just do kind of the same thing here, and we can click Tailwind here. It will cost us our Talonflame. I think it's less important now because we do actually have Squawkabilly in the back to handle the Primarina. So let's go ahead and go for this. Now our Hariyama is 83 base speed, so if there is no Follow Me that comes out from this Clefairy, Thundurus actually won't be able to attack the Talonflame. So I think best case scenario for him has got to be Follow Me plus Wallbolt Storm, as I think he's probably got to try to take out the Talonflame here. If we get a decent roll, hopefully Clefairy should go down to that. And then we can, of course, send in our Ogre. A similar scenario to this game. It could also be Protect from the Thundurus. I think that's pretty unlikely as Clefairy doesn't accomplish anything in this position. But I guess we'll see. Alright, Terra Steel actually going to come out from the Clefairy, so it will take 0 damage from this Poison Jab as Wallbolt Storm connects and takes out the Talonflame. Alright, let's go ahead and I think we can pretty safely protect both on this turn. I do want to still maintain the advantage that we do have of speed control here. So let's actually go ahead and go for the close combat here into the Clefairy here. Should take it out here, and let's go for Spiky Shield on the Ogerpon. I think this could be protect from either Pokemon here. Honestly, we are just kind of requiring good reads at this point. Okay, it is actually the Annihilate switch and protect from the Thunderous. This close combat will hit into an immune Annihilate. Okay, we still have 2 turns of Tailwind left, so our opponent is not actually faster with either Pokemon here. The truth is, though, that Annihilate with the Choice Scarf does actually wall a lot of our damage. It still does take a ton of damage from our Hariyama. So I am going to go ahead and fire a Headlong Rush into that slot. It would have been smarter to do so earlier, just because Primarina could have switched into that slot, but I'm honestly not too upset about it. And so we will click the Ivy Cudgel into this slot. Crit does obviously help. Drain Punch will drop Ogerpon down to the low. And now we are in, again, a pretty decent spot. Let's go ahead and click the Close Combat here into the Clefairy. And in my opinion, we can probably just click the Spiky Shield here. I think our opponent's last Pokemon is probably going to be the Primarina. But without any Terra, it is pretty weak to both of our Pokemon that we have here. This combat should take out the Clefairy there. And Rain and Tailwind are going to end here. If our opponent's final Pokemon is Rillaboom, it does mean that Hariyama can be left alive thanks to the grassy terrain. Although, like I said, I think it's still pretty likely to be the Primarina. Alright, Thunderous is going to come back out. Our opponent can grab a KO on either Pokemon here, so I think what we want to do here is try to deal with the Pokemon in front of us as best that we can. So for that reason, I think we want to try to KO the Thunderous, as that's the only Pokemon we know for certain that we can actually KO. We can also, with the Ogerpon, attempt to block an attack. I think right now what we need is probably a Wild Bolt Storm miss and Annihilate to attack into a Protect. So it is actually going to be a Protect from the Thunderous, as Annihilate attacks into the Protect. Does take a little bit of damage there, but unfortunately Hariyama will drop, and so Squawkabilly going to come in now. Now, we are Choice Scarfed, and it will depend on whether or not our opponent... Actually, we do guaranteed outspeed and Annihilate. We cannot lock into Tailwind here, in my opinion. So I think we have to lock in Brave Bird here, and I think we have to lock in Ivy Cudgel. Brave Bird does come out, and it takes out the Annihilate. While Bolt Storm looks like does connect on both and take out both, so an unfortunate loss for us there. And yeah, that is unfortunately another loss in a row for your Bewears. That was a pretty great set. I do think that we misplayed a couple of times, but I do think that we still put a lot on the table there. But yeah, that is all I have for you for week number 3. Unfortunate that we did take another loss. Like I said, I'm still feeling pretty good about your Bewears. I think we are still one of the favorites to make playoffs here, despite 2 losses in 3 weeks. We can definitely turn this around, and I think that our schedule does get a lot easier from this point forward. But with all that being said, that is all I have for you for this week. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.